Welcome to the Reformed Devils. I'm Professor John Barth, and with me is Professor Owen Anderson. We are professors at Arizona State University, the largest Research One university, public university in the United States. I teach history, he teaches philosophy. We're both Reformed Christians. I'm Reformed, he's Presbyterian, but we both agree on the five solas: solely grace alone, faith alone, scripture alone, Christ alone. Soli Deo Gloria is our creed. And today we are going to open a discussion on critical theory. Now, we're not going to cover all the bases today. You can't do that in one half-hour podcast. However, what we would like to do is to explore the origins, the philosophical origins, and then in later podcasts we can elaborate further on today's the critical theory that is invoked today. But Owen, I thought it would be a good way to start by just defining what we mean by critical theory.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, because there's a lot in the news about critical theory, and especially critical theory in education. And so parents might wonder, well, what is it even? Or students might wonder if they're going to university and they've been told, yeah, you're going to get a lot of critical theory there. Well, what's that? So the key word there, I mean, I think we kind of know what theory is, but what's critical theory? And I don't know about in history departments. I'm guessing this is true, but definitely in philosophy departments, the phrase critical thinking is a buzzword. Everyone says, I want my students to learn how to think critically. So the issue is, well, how do we do that? What does that mean, to think critically? Are we actually teaching our students to think critically? So a quick definition of that: thinking critically means you can identify your assumptions and use reason to test them for meaning. If you're not able to identify your assumptions, you're not thinking critically. So in the history of philosophy, that's kind of what philosophers do. I mean, it's kind of what we find Socrates doing, but it really is what it takes a turn in the history of philosophy with Descartes at the beginning of the modern age. And he ushered in what's been called critical philosophy. So he has a critique that he gives where he wants to question everything, even questioning. I mean, everything's being questioned. Reason itself will be questioned. And so people probably know something of Descartes. They've heard of I think, therefore I am. That's the outcome of his critical process. He's trying to figure out, can I know anything? And that's what he came up with. I think, therefore I am. I can know I exist. And from there, what else can I know? So critical philosophy means we identify our assumptions. We're questioning everything. But Descartes didn't want to stop there. And a lot of times I get this sense from people that they think you just learn to critically think and you question everything, and that's just sort of what you do, right? Versus, no, you actually want to come to answers. That's the whole point of it. And Descartes thought he came to some answers, and that's what we want to do also. So flash forward to Kant, and Kant sort of exemplifies a critical philosophy. He has his main books all start with the word critique of pure reason, critique of practical reason. And again, he's questioning even reason, even the very thing we think about the world with, he's questioning. And so I think both those philosophers have important things for us to study. You'll find people who reject them. Maybe someone who really likes medieval philosophy will reject them as bad or whatnot. But I think it's important to learn this critical philosophy. I think you and I would both say we want our students to learn to think critically and question their assumptions.
Exactly. So the question is, what do you mean by critical theory? I would like to offer up what I believe critical theory represents today. I think you
can I make a quick connection?
Yeah, sure.
Because Kant is, early 1800s. So how do we get to where we're at today? I'll come up to about the 1950s, where I think you'll pick up. And so when we hear about critical theory, what we're hearing about really is something coming out of a group of Marxist thinkers. And they're assuming the Marxist material dialectic. They're materialists about the world. And they're using critical thinking to deconstruct other views. They themselves, they're not doing what Descartes and Kant did, which is critique themselves. Because if they were, then they would raise questions. They'd raise about their assumptions of materialism, which is a very weak philosophy. And they'd say, well, this doesn't actually represent reality. So when we get now to what you'll be presenting on, I think critical theory, what we find is that it's trying to change society and critique society through Marxist materialism.
And some of them, without going too much into the weeds, many of them were inspired by Hegelian idealism as well. And so you have, it's a mixed bag. It's a, there's a whole lot.
I mean, Marx was a Hegelian, right? He's a materialist Hegelian. Yeah.
Yep. He was one of the members of the young Hegelians. But if I may, Owen, just for our audience, if there's, okay, what is critical theory today? I think you've boiled it down in the last couple minutes. I would add to that. It's a theory that, among other things, that power dynamics are just baked into everything. Like everything.
That's right.
All the societal superstructures, political institutions, social institutions, cultural institutions, the family.
All those are about power.
It's all about power. It's all about power. Science, medicine, as you pointed out, even reason itself, and critical theorists in today's sense divide society into dominant identities and marginalized identities. And according to critical theorists, truth and knowledge are socially constructed deliberately by dominant groups to advance the interests of the dominant group. And so that's part of what deconstructions are. Yes. So you laid out critical philosophy, which we agree with. Who would disagree that theories and knowledge ought to be critically examined?
You mentioned power dynamics, and I skipped from Kant up to the 1950s, skipping over a fellow named Nietzsche. And he's sort of the end of the Enlightenment. What I mean is, the Enlightenment made certain claims about knowledge that got challenged and found to come short, and he really embodies that challenge. So we want to be able to respond to the challenges he brought up, or the person I think is even more clever is David Hume. David Hume is like a surgeon, and Nietzsche is like a rock star. And Nietzsche is not very careful in a lot of the things he says, and it's not very self-reflective, whereas Hume is very precise and very good with what he's doing. But the point would still be the same, which is Nietzsche became an anti-intellectual and analyzed everything in terms of power, which is not a belief category. It's a relational category. And so that's what we see today. In the academy, it's become anti-intellectual, which can surprise people, but it shouldn't, because it happens a number of times in the history of the academy. So everything is a power dynamic. And in one way, what they'll say is, we're just doing democracy. Everybody should be completely equal, no one above others, no aristocrats, no kings, but also no parents, no fathers, no authority figures, unless they're agreed upon 100%. Otherwise, it's unfair. Now, in the background of that, this democratic view, you have somebody named Lucifer. And Lucifer represents this view. Sometimes they use him on purpose. Doesn't mean they believe he's real, but he represents what they're saying, which is, I'm not even going to do what God says. And so there's a kind of hatred in the background for the very idea of our Heavenly Father. That's the best example of use of power against our freedom. So it's in that sense, they say we're democratic and we want pure freedom to do whatever we want. Sometimes to summarize, have you heard this? Do what thou wilt is the whole of the law.
Is that Aleister Crowley?
Yeah, it comes up in the Satanic Bible also.
So I think absolutely right. It's this anti all authority. And I wonder too if this is also connected to existentialism, or I don't wonder. I think we both know that it is, and that it's up to each individual to create your own values, to determine your own meaning.
Doesn't that sound just like the temptation in Genesis 3?
Exactly. Determine your own meaning in a meaningless world. In a world that doesn't have meaning, you may as well, you yourself construct your own values, your own meaning, and then in existentialist philosophy, it's all about be authentic, be yourself.
Yeah.
And so anyone, any authority whatsoever, I've actually heard, I don't know if you've encountered this, but I've heard instructors at the university, a small minority of them, they don't like to call their students, they don't call them students. Mm-hmm. They call them I think it's like collaborator or something.
Yeah.
You know, they say, I want to be on an equal plane with everybody.
Yep.
For me, no, that's absolutely not the case. I'm the authority in the classroom.
You're a specialist who studied to get into this position. You hopefully know more than them, so you can impart that knowledge.
Right. So, you know, but I think that philosophy also is in the background here and is very important.
Well, I think the idea that I would even go along with saying we as individuals bear responsibility. I think the existentialist emphasis on the individual bearing ultimate responsibility for themselves is actually healthy. But you had the full definition. Existentialism says in a meaningless world. So the world is meaningless, and so I have to make my meaning, versus, no, I've been created by God, and I bear ultimate responsibility for knowing that. So to contrast with do what thou wilt is the whole of the law, I think Augustine is right. He says it this way: do what you want and love God. Or the Apostle Paul might say, all things are permissible, but not all things are beneficial. So yeah, do whatever you want, but hopefully that's ordered towards the highest good, which is knowing God. Right. Because then that will shape what you actually want to do. You're not going to want to do a whole bunch of things.
And the difference between true liberty and libertinism.
Yeah, or licentiousness,
yeah, you know, and that's a key distinction, because also, and I don't mean to get too far off track here, you know, the Bible also makes clear that everyone's a slave to something. You're either a slave to the world, to your flesh, or you're a slave to righteousness, and everyone has a master of some sort. And those who fool themselves into thinking, oh, I'm being my authentic self, I'm going to do whatever I want to do, without even knowing it, are enslaved. You're in bondage. You are not free. You've bought the lie that you are free. You are not free.
The bondage of the will. You think it's free and it's actually not. I think that, and so that's why I would say the problem isn't democratic individualism. Even if I think maybe there's a better form of government, the problem isn't that. The problem isn't radical individualism. You could have both of those with someone who says, I want to know my highest good. So the problem is this anti-intellectualism position, which is based in skepticism and says we really can't know. So when you are in charge of me, you're imposing your opinions on me, and that's not right, because they're just your opinions, and I've got my opinions. Knowledge changes all that. As soon as there's knowledge, oh, okay, well, I do want to learn from you because I don't know and you do know, so please teach me. And so we get these relationships in culture then. And I think that's what the fifth commandment means when it says, honor your father and mother. It's not simply biological. It's because the next generation wasn't at Sinai. So how are they going to learn the law? From their mother and father. So you learn from those who know, and you have to respect that process. So this idea of radical individualism and radical revolution is rooted in skepticism. And I think that's really what we need to address. We're made to know things. We can and should know things. And true responsibility is based on that.
Absolutely. Amen, brother.
Now tell us a little bit, though. Let's talk about some of the critical theorists. I think maybe what we'll do is we'll have future episodes going into more detail. But I think you could maybe help us connect some things from Nietzsche to the present.
Right. If I may, I would like to rewind a little bit from Nietzsche back to the Enlightenment, because I think the Enlightenment, and I know we touch on Descartes. Descartes in the 17th century. Kant is late Enlightenment, but there's Rousseau, and Rousseau is central to this discussion. Now, what Rousseau and others like him in the Enlightenment posited, his famous quote, I think it's the first, if I'm not mistaken, it's the first line in his book, Social Contract. Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. And it sounds good. It's like a good bumper sticker slogan. Okay. I remember actually when I was, oh, what a great quote, you know.
You could have your poster of Nietzsche, and then that quote next to it, right? And that's like a, the
Yeah.
early years of college.
Yeah, that's right. It sounds so good, but once you dissect it and really think about it, and years of experience and maturity, you realize, like, wait, that's like totally incorrect. So what Rousseau is saying is that man is naturally good. Man is born, so it's a rejection of original sin.
Yeah.
Okay. And by the way, the notion of the question of nature, obviously the Bible takes a very definite position on that. There's no question where the Bible stands on that. However, even in secular philosophy, many secular philosophers outside of the Christian tradition, even predating Christ during some of the old Greek and Roman philosophers, also agreed that human nature is radically depraved.
Yeah.
And so, but this is a rejection of that. And Rousseau believed that man could even be perfectible, barring the corrupting influences of bad intentions. Yeah. Okay, so implicit in that is, if you change the institutions, if you radically change, upend the societal superstructures, you create a new man. And this notion, this concept was carried over during in Marxism, Leninism, the concept of under Lenin and Stalin, and
the new man,
the new Soviet man. Under Mao's cultural revolution. Why did Mao wage a cultural revolution? Overturning the old societal superstructures, the traditions, and create a communist man. But this was a very common. So basically, and I'll move on from Rousseau, there was a split in the Enlightenment. There were some Enlightenment thinkers who believed man was naturally depraved.
Yeah.
But there were others like Rousseau who believed man was naturally good.
And so if you just get the social construct or the social contract right, you would perfect humans.
Right. Like Madison, for example, believed humans were naturally depraved. That's why in the Constitution, there's all these checks and balances.
So for him, the government's to keep you in check because of your inclinations.
Right.
More like Romans 13.
Right. And then within the government itself, Madison assumes that there's going to be power hungry, greedy, like murderous individuals. So he's like, we need to make sure they can't get the upper hand. But anyway, so this was a very popular train of thought in the Enlightenment. Joseph Priestley, Condorcet, Marquis de Condorcet, French Revolution, big French revolutionist. Rousseauian, he said, this is a quote, the perfectibility of man is absolutely indefinite. And then one more quote from Condorcet that's really interesting and ties into critical theory. This is from Marquis de Condorcet, French revolutionist, 1790s, was ultimately executed by the Jacobins, by the way. But anyway, he said this. Doesn't this sound like critical theory? Quote, is there any vicious habit, any practice contrary to good faith, any crime, is there any crime whose origin and first cause cannot be traced back to the legislation, the institutions, the prejudices of the country? And so Rousseau and others like him and his forebears identify social problems, and this is key to current day critical theory.
Yeah.
Social problems are chiefly, if not exclusively, the product of a society's structures and cultural assumptions. The biblical answer is no. Social problems are the result of sin. Yeah. And when institutions are corrupt, that's because there are sinful men in those institutions. And so good institutions should be designed as such to prevent sinful man from taking over. But anyway.
Well, and think about the idea of our problems are due to our received legislation.
Yep.
That push that back far enough, and what you're doing again is you're just getting back to blaming God. Yep. God gave us a law, but it's just not that good, and we can make a much better law that will solve human problems.
And that's what equity is about. So equity is very different from equality. I think most of our viewers know this.
Tell us so.
So like classical equality is I believe Thomas Sowell called it a process equality, is how he differentiated it, is that you have equal rules in law, and equality. We see this all throughout our Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Equality of law. One class doesn't get special privileges, legal privileges that another class doesn't. Equity is a belief that results equality.
Yeah.
is necessary, if not for each individual, then across groups.
Yeah,
and so
statistically.
again, identity is very important in modern day critical theory. And so each different group must have equal results. And if they don't, then that signals that there is an institutional failure, that there's a problem somewhere in the institution that must be corrected so that those equal results can be accomplished. And so it's no longer a matter of individual responsibility. Hey, maybe maybe this person isn't succeeding because of bad choices they made, or because it could be a whole range of things. It becomes a
and the government's job is to
problem.
make sure it comes out that way, or it's not being equitable.
Now, one interesting thing about Rousseau, and this takes us to Marx, Rousseau identified private property as one of the institutions that corrupted man. And actually, before Marx, a lot of people will assume Marx was the first communist socialist. No, there were communists and socialists prior to Marx, in France primarily, actually. The first socialists were in France in the 1790s. But Marx came up with this theory of history where class conflict is the driving force. It's all about the oppressor versus the oppressed. And so that's where we have the introduction of conflict and identity.
That's the kind of the beginning of that anti-intellectualism. And then Nietzsche's statement, beliefs about the will to power. Truth isn't the issue, power is the issue. So it's not a matter of I need to come to the truth, because there's a way in which no one can stop you from coming to know the truth. You can think about it whenever you want, but you don't want to. So that's where you say your will is in bondage, because you don't actually want to know the truth. So the will to power and the conflict theory of history is that turn toward anti-intellectualism. But let me add one more thing. I think in both of them, especially Marx and the Marxists and the critical theorists, the focus is on what I call natural evils. Natural evils would be things like toil in this life, getting your bread by the sweat of your brow, famines that come up, there's not enough food, plagues that come up, wars that come up. And so what the communists convinced people in their lands was that if they reordered society, they would be able to quell those, or at least greatly diminish them. So you had less toil, and therefore not famines, and you'd be able to have a great medical system that gets rid of plagues, and you'll end wars, at least within the system that the communists that accept this won't have wars with each other. So people believed that and went along with it. And so we in our day are also open to that same temptation if we don't understand why there's natural evils. If the main purpose of our life is spent on trying to diminish natural evils and not on our problem of moral evil, we use the word sin, same thing, that's our real problem. Lenin had no promise, no way of overcoming moral evil. His own life was filled with moral evil. And he didn't have any redemption, no offer of redemption to people. So our concern as humans should be, how can I be redeemed? How can I be saved from moral evil? Because I know it's a problem. I find myself not wanting to do it, but I still do it. I don't have any power to change myself. And the critical theorists, in all of their search for equity, don't have any solution for that.
Nope, that's right. So from our perspective, okay, it's a sin problem. And so we recognize, because all men have sinned, talking about inclusivity.
There's inclusivity.
No exceptions. Okay, all have sinned. So we recognize that utopia is impossible here on this earth. A utopia is not possible. Can't happen. Will never happen. And if anyone promises utopia, you should run in the opposite direction, because it usually leads, almost always, actually in every case, leads to some disaster or another. So how do we just throw up our hands and say, oh, we'll just live our lives and not think at all bettering the world? No, absolutely not. What you need in a free society, a prosperous society, a good society, you need to construct systems that recognize the fallenness of man, and then create incentives for virtuous behavior and disincentives for immoral behavior. And you know what? No matter how good you write those laws, there's going to be criminals. There's going to be
some way around it. Well, you know what? And what you just said is key, because on the critical theory approach, it's someone else's fault.
Mm-hmm.
Why am I here? Someone else did something. A rich person did something. Whereas what you're suggesting, and what I would agree with, is we have to take, this is that radical responsibility, actually have radical responsibility for myself. Whatever it might be true that a rich person oppressed me. That very well could be true, that they like money and they take money from others.
Absolutely.
But that's not my biggest problem. My biggest problem is I've rejected the glory of God.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I should take responsibility for.
On Judgment Day, you're not going to be able to point fingers at anyone else.
Yeah. Yep. And there is a great day of judgment.
There's a day of judgment.
That should put the fear of the Lord into people.
If you think you're going to be able to look God in the face and say, but, you know, this person did that, you know, this, look at the society I was born in, that doesn't fly.
Yeah.
You know, you are responsible for your own sin.
Well, and what's interesting is we're kind of taking their ideas and saying it's much worse than you think. Because they would say, oh, society's corrupt and we need to change it. And we're not denying that. We're saying it's way more corrupt than you think it is. Not only are rich people stealing money from everyone else,
yep,
everybody's rejected what's clear about God. It's way worse.
Yeah, right.
And they say, well, you need to take responsibility for contributing to the system. Mm-hmm. And we're not denying that. We're saying you have to take even more responsibility, right? So
100%.
Yeah. So it's not, in that way we could say you guys just aren't going far enough in your ideas.
By the way, that was I think. By the way, Owen, I think we should probably save the. We were going to talk about the Frankfurt School and Foucault. I think that might be better for another video.
Yeah, we'll come back to those. I think there's a lot of interest.
I wanted to close on this subject because you know, the whole theory, the justification, which I disagree with, of absolute monarchy back in the day was that an absolute monarch will understand and know that he truly isn't absolute, that he's going to have to answer someday to God, and that will check that monarch. The problem with that whole theory was that you had a whole lot of monarchs who were who rejected even any knowledge of God, who didn't believe that they would have to answer to God, and so they did whatever they wanted anyway. And so that's the Constitution here in the United States, that it's designed in such a way, when properly enforced, designed in such a way to make sure when you get those power hungry men and women in office, that there are 1,000,001 ways to check them. And we're not relying solely on believing that they believe in a judgment. If you believe in a judgment, though, that should be sufficient.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is, in other words, we put human checks in place of the fear of God.
Right.
And they'll work so-so, but again, you'll still have people who find ways to get around it. So really what you're kind of raising is, what if people don't fear God? And the answer is, it's going to be a mess.
Mm-hmm.
Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, which means if you don't fear God, your society has no wisdom.
Mm-hmm. But this is why the state, there is a necessity for a state. Like, we don't believe in anarchy. You know, we're not going to just assume that everyone has a fear of God and will live their lives accordingly. Look, if everyone did, maybe you could talk that you could consider that. I would still maybe suggest that it would work out. But
I think Locke has a quote. Is it Locke that has a quote like that about, we don't live in a society of angels, we live in a society of humans, and that's why we need law.
That's why we need law. That's why we need the state. And
but let me add one thing in here, a little twist for our Reform viewers, which is also a teaser, because we won't go into this in detail today. But some of what you said about utopia might draw out the difference between an amillennialist and a premillennialist. Now, I wouldn't want to say I believe in utopia, but I do believe in this, that the nations will be discipled. The Great Commission will be fulfilled by the church. And so when that happens, it's going to be a pretty nice situation. And I think that does happen before Christ returns. But it's the work of the church, not the state.
I'm undecided between mill and post mill.
Yeah.
I'm on the fence.
Well, I think we both agree, though, the state isn't going to bring about utopia.
Oh no, no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I was just speaking of eschatology.
Yeah, yeah, oh yeah.
I'm a bit agnostic on
Mhm.
that. You're not gonna find me tempted dispensationalism.
Yeah. Well, I
No
think
offense to
I had a
anyone.
friend
I know we,
who says he's pan millennial. It'll all pan out in the end.
there you go. Well, that's why that's why both of our confessions are, I believe the Westminster is this way
Yeah.
too. I know the London Baptist is actually pretty open-ended
Yeah, they
about
didn't take a
eschatology,
position on that.
which I think is very good.
I think the
know?
majority were post mill, but there was enough that were on
Mhm.
mill. They didn't take a position. So it's, but so recapping,
Yep.
we'll get into some more critical theorists and philosophers next time. They're in that
Mhm.
school, but today we've given you kind of intellectual history and talked about the problem, which is two. It was skepticism, which says we can't know anything and makes everything into a power relationship, and then the desire
Mhm.
to overcome natural evil rather than sin.
All right. So yeah, we'll cover next time. We'll cover Frankfurt School. So Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse. We'll look at, and then we'll go into deconstructionists and Foucault and all the rest. So tune in next time. I think you'll really enjoy it. Hope this was helpful to get some of the early origins.
Mm-hmm.
Some see you all next
Good
time.
context. Bye. Yeah, great context. Yeah, thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.
All right, good. That one, I think that was a really good one.
Yep. Sorry if we got too sidetracked on
No,
various
not at
things.
all. No, I think it was really